In the last video, we added a tremendous amount of markup to our request new component. Let's now continue with this component by wiring up our onSubmit event handler right here. So just like our previous onSubmit handlers, this one is going to look very similar. We're going to first get a reference to our campaign instance by using our address. We'll then set up a try catch. We'll call a function on the campaign, and hopefully it all goes through. So let's first get started by getting access to our campaign instance. We've already set up the getInitialProps function right here that takes the address out of the URL and returns it as a prop to be used inside of our component. We've also already imported our campaign function at the very top. So we can use those two things to get access to our campaign instance. So I'll say inside of our onSubmit handler, const campaign is going to be capital C campaign, and we're going to pass in this .props.address, like so. Now when we use this campaign right here to eventually call the createRequest function, we're going to want to pass in our description, the value, and the recipient address. And we've been recording all those three properties on our state object. So let's destructure those properties off right up here before we need them, just to keep our code a little bit more concise. So right after we create our campaign, we'll do const description, value, and recipient from this .state. Then right after that, we can place our try catch statement. So we'll do try, we'll place our catch, and we'll receive the error object if one occurs. Then inside the try, we'll do the same thing as before. We'll get our list of accounts and then use the account at 0 to send in a request to our createRequest function. So we'll do const accounts equals await web3.eth.getAccounts. We'll then do await campaign.methods.createRequest. Now when we call createRequest right here, we have to pass in the three arguments, description, value, and recipient. But remember, when these arguments get passed into our actual Solidity function, they have to be passed in the correct order. So let's very quickly open up our contract file and just verify the order in which we're supposed to pass these things in. So inside my Ethereum contracts campaign.sol file, I'll find the createRequest function. Here it is right here. You might have to scroll down a little bit. Remember, it's like halfway down the file. So here's createRequest. The expectation here is that we're going to pass in first our description, then the value, and then the address. So that's the order in which we pass these in. One other thing that I want to point out is that we've been assuming that value right here would be passed in as a way value. So we expect this to be way as opposed to ether. And we can actually just verify that very quickly by looking down at finalize request. So finalize request right here, eventually we call the transfer method and we pass in request.value. So we're not doing any change of units here from way over to ether or anything like that. So we need to make sure that when we pass in the amount of ether or way that we want to tie to this request, it has to be in units of way. All right, so back over inside of our onSubmit function, here's createRequest. We're going to first pass in description, and then we need to pass in value. But value right here, remember, inside of our form, we mark the form as saying like value in ether. We're expecting our users to type a ether value in here. So we're going to use Web3 to convert value over to way, just as we did a moment ago. For this, I'm going to give myself just a little bit of space here. So I'm going to do some new lines. And then I'll do web3.utils.toWay. We'll take our value and convert it from ether to way. All right, and then finally, we're going to take our recipient address and pass that in as the third argument. Now the very last step is to chain on our .send and say who is sending this request in. So this is going to be from accounts at 0, like so. All right, I'm going to save the file. When I do, you're going to see my code jump a little bit. Again, that's my formatter in action. Before we test this out in the browser, we have to make sure that we wire up the onSubmit function right here to our actual form. So that's the one thing that we have not yet taken care of. So if I go down to my form component right here, we need to make sure that we define the onSubmit handler, and we tell this thing to call this.onSubmit whenever someone submits the form. All right, so now we're ready to test this thing out. I'm going to flip back over to my browser. I'm going to do a hard refresh of this entire page. There we go. Now, one thing that I have people very frequently ask me about is this little icon that I have right here. This little icon is very particular to my browser. I'm running a password manager that tries to automatically deal with forms on the screen, and that's why I have this icon right here. But you probably will not have that icon unless you use the same password manager. The other thing I want to mention is that you'll see down here we've got a warning now about extra attributes. We'll deal with this in just a little bit, but for right now, let's just focus on the form. So as we fill out the form, we'll put in a description first. We'll say something like, I don't know, buy battery casings. That's going to be the description of my first spending request. I'm also going to zoom this in so you can see my text a little bit more easily. Next, I'll specify my value in Ether. Remember, at this point, we can only try to send off an amount of Ether less than our contract balance. Now, there's no limitation on creating requests with 999 Ether. We can definitely create requests, but if we ever want to actually finalize this request, we won't be able to source, 9,999 Ether. So I know that my contract right now has about 0.003 Ether, because that's how many times I've contributed to it. So I'm going to just try to request out of it 0.001 Ether. That's all I'm going to try to deal with here. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that the recipient right here must be a valid address. So we can't just put gibberish in here. It's got to be a real address. Obviously, we're going to probably want to verify that someone successfully gets sent some money here. So to make sure that I'm working with a real address that can receive some amount of money, I'm going to go back up to MetaMask, and I'm going to attempt to create a second account. Now, chances are you might have already clicked on this create account button once. So if you already have another account in here labeled as account 2, just go ahead and swap over to that one. Otherwise, if you only have one account like me, you can click on create account. Now, when we create this account, remember how we had previously said that MetaMask is generating these accounts. They're all tied to our single 12-word mnemonic. So this is not really truly creating a completely new and separate account. It's still somewhat kind of tied to our first one. Anyways, the point here is all we really need to do is get access to this address and enter in this other recipient, or this recipient entry right here with this address. So then when we eventually approve and finalize this request, we can actually receive money on this other account right here, and we can just verify it inside of our transaction history. So I'm going to click the ... I'm going to copy address to clipboard, and then I'll paste it in as the recipient, like so. All right, so now the moment of truth. We're going to click on create, and we should see our MetaMask notification here pop up. Now, here's one thing that's interesting. You'll notice that we have a message on here that says insufficient balance. So what's this mean? Well, it means that I'm still selecting account number 2 as being the source for this transaction. But account number 2 for me right now has not enough money to actually cover the transaction. So that's why I'm seeing this warning message here on the screen. So I think that we probably need to go back over to account number 1 where we actually have some Ether available and use that to source the transaction. So I'm going to reject this one. I'm going to go back over to MetaMask. I'm going to use the little selecty thing right here to go back over to account number 1. And then I'll click on create again. Okay, so now we're using the correct account to create this transaction. I'm using account number 1, and that is the account with all my money tied to it. So I'm now going to submit this, and we could pretty much just wait. Remember that right now, we have absolutely nothing inside of our application to really verify whether or not this request is being created successfully. So I think that at this point, we need to add in a couple of last little finishing touches around this form, and then immediately start working on our component that's going to list out all the different requests that have been created. Then we'll be able to actually verify that this request was made successfully. Okay, so let's pause right here. We're going to do a couple last finishing touches on this form in the next video, and then continue on to our request list component.